International Women's Day was recognized by the UN in 1975, following a decade of women's struggle known as the second wave of feminism. For them, it's about celebrating women's achievements, raising awareness, lobby, and fundraise for female-focused charities. For the women who initiated International Women's Day, this must be an insult. International Women's Day in 2021 goes under the theme of Women in Leadership, but not a word about the threat that is posed on women's emancipation by the mix of COVID, lockdowns, and the economic crisis. The history of International Women's Day is a massive wave of strikes by the female textile workers in the United States. They went on strike again and again against the hunger wages and the appalling conditions in which they had to work. In hundreds of thousands, they revolted against an economic system that didn't allow them a full life, a life of bread and roses, and assure a better future for their children. They confronted brutal repression from the bosses and the state security forces. In 1909, the Socialist Party of America called for the first National Women's Day on the 28th of February. These masses of working women and their demands were not reflected in the leadership of the women's movement, led by bourgeois women who fought for the same ruling class privileges as the men of their class. They wanted the support of the masses of working class women in the struggle for the right to vote, but refused to give support to working women fighting for their own demands, a living wage, trade union rights, in order to be able to fight in an effective way the 8-hour working day. This example of mass working women's resistance was taken on by women in the socialist movement to start pushing the workers' movement to include women's demands in their program and to start organizing working women on a national and international level so they can play a role, develop a program and a strategy that was independent of the establishment feminists of their time. One woman played a key role in this work, Clara Zetkin, a German revolutionary socialist. She started the organization of the International Working Women's Conferences, and it was the second of these international conferences in 1910 that voted unanimously to call for an international day in which working women around the world would campaign for their demands. In 1911, on the first ever International Women's Day, more than 1 million women worldwide participated in rallies, demonstrations, and strikes in 17 different countries. There were working class parties actually took up the challenge of starting to organize the masses of working women radicalized by the brutal exploitation and oppression. The results were huge. In Germany and Austria, hundreds of thousands of women were organized in working women's clubs. In the First World War, these clubs were active in organizing anti-war protests and hunger marches against the spiraling cost of food and mass pauperization, while the rich were only getting richer. But the most consequential International Women's Day in the world to this date was in 1917, 28th of February on the Russian calendar, when a call for a strike on International Women's Day by factory workers in St. Petersburg led to the women strikers convincing all workers for an all-out strike against the war and for bread. It became the start of the February Revolution, the first stage of the Russian Revolution. The Young Workers' State was not only the first state that gave women the right to bodily autonomy with easy divorce and abortion rights, but also provided the first public services that had as an explicit goal to socialize what is still being called domestic chores today. Women were also involved in running the society, not just through representation, but through the involvement of the masses of women in the women's councils. Making a giant leap to the situation that we have before us today, the lessons of this first wave of feminism, the need for the masses of working and poor women to organize for their own demands, independent of the forces of establishment feminism, are more valid than ever. Whereas women's rights have progressed, with legal equality having been won in most of the advanced capitalist countries following the second wave of feminist struggle in the 1960s and 70s, the last decade of rising struggle of women around the world highlights how legal equality is important, but largely insufficient to solve our problems. Capitalism is a brutal system that needs divisions and oppression of women, of people of color, of LGBTQI people, of national and religious minorities, in order to keep the power in the hands of a small parasitic minority of billionaires. In its constant hunger for profits, the last decades of austerity have undermined the gains of the working class and women's post-war struggles by the introduction of low-wage jobs, by the breaking down of the living standards of the workers, by the privatization and underfinancing of public services that make it possible for working mothers to combine waged work with the responsibility for raising children. When this program of austerity was accelerated after the 2008 financial and economic crisis, robbing growing layers of women of the possibility of economic independence, it led to a third wave of mass women's struggle, which is still growing today and reaching new parts of the world, as with the new wave of Me Too in China and the Balkans, for instance. At the same time, lessons are being learned as to who are our allies and who is the enemy. A process of growing solidarity between different layers of the oppressed and of a joint fight against the system as a whole. Women are not just fighting for their own rights as women, but are also to be found in the first ranks of revolts all over the world against the ruling elites and governments, demanding an end to austerity, refusing to be the ones to pay for the capitalist crisis, refusing the inequality and oppression which is inherent to capitalism. Whereas the pandemic and the economic crisis threaten women's rights and gains of past struggles, women all over the world refuse to go backwards instead of forwards. When we go to the streets on International Women's Day 2021 with International Socialist Alternative and Rosa International Socialist Feminists, it is not on the program of the United Nations, but on a program for fundamental change to take on the roots of women's oppression. The fact that the wealth produced by the international working class in all its diversity is used to enrich the billionaire class instead of being used to respond to the needs of humanity. This hunger for profit enforces billions of hours of unpaid work on women to cater for the needs of their families, instead of being able to use it to create collective public services to make sure everyone is catered for. The hunger for profits forces millions of workers to work for wages that don't pay the rent, leaving large layers of working women the choice between being dependent on men's wages or face extreme poverty for themselves and their children. The hunger for profits condemns women to being underpaid and undervalued, leaving them dependent and therefore vulnerable for violence, with the state assuring that gender violence is the most unpunished crime there is. The history of working women's struggles show that we can win if we fight. But it also shows us that if we do not get rid of capitalism, that we will have to fight again and again and again to just keep what we have already won by our struggles. If we want to win big, if we want to win decisively, fundamentally, and definitively, we need to be part of the movement for socialism and help build the movements and organizations that can get us there.